Hi everyone, welcome or welcome back to Misinformation in Science and Society. Here to listen, not to judge. I'm your host Annie, and today with us we have Aaron Weiner. Welcome. Could you please introduce yourself a little bit and what you do?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm Dr. Aaron Weiner. I'm a licensed clinical psychologist. I'm an addiction specialist. And what I do is two primary things. One is I'm a clinician, so I work with folks on addiction related issues and then also general mental health concerns, depression, anxiety, trauma, really the full range of problems that people might bring to therapy. But then the other thing that I do and that I'm very passionate about is education. I'm a professional speaker and I talk to folks all over the country about those same topics, about mental health and how you can support it, about addiction, and about how particularly young folks can navigate their way through a world that is increasingly designed to hook you in through some of these addictive processes, whether or not it's substances or gaming or just all sorts of things right now in the world, social media that's really designed in ways that's meant to hook you in and keep you coming back so that people can make money off of you,
hmm
unfortunately. And so, yeah, that's primarily what I'm doing these days.
Yeah, so what kind of inspired you to go on like this path, choose this career like initially? Yeah.
Well, back when I was younger, I naively thought that because I was always the friend that people talked to about their problems, that I would make a great therapist.
hmm
And I guess it worked out, but there's so much more to it than that. But ultimately, along the way in college, I realized that I just find human behavior very interesting. Why we do what we do. There's always a reason, and so many people aren't actually quite sure what that is unless they
hmm
start to peek inside. And I found that very interesting. Addiction and how I got into that largely has to do with the fact, if I'm just really cutting to the heart of it, is that it's this great combination from a treatment perspective anyway of education and therapy. There's a lot to learn, and then there's also a therapeutic process to go through, and that really appealed to me, and I liked doing that work. And when people recover from an addiction, there's so much of their life that they can reclaim, and that really appealed to me too. And the last component, the whole public speaking side, kind of fell into by accident. It was a component of my job when I was directing an addiction service line in the western suburbs of Chicago.
hmm
And I just started speaking in public a lot, and I really enjoyed it. And also kind of realized that ultimately being a clinician is a very reactive focus. Someone has a problem, you're trying to help them get over it. And I just saw a lot of benefit also from getting at mental health and public health from a proactive perspective. And how can we potentially give people the information that they need to make healthier decisions, work their way out of mild problems on their own and not let them grow. I just saw so much just personal meaning in going further upstream. And
hmm
it turned out that I had a knack for speaking. And so I kind of put those two things together. And a few years back, I went into business for myself and have been doing that ever since.
Yeah, that's awesome. So, um, I'm curious, how have the challenges that like teenagers face in terms of like mental health and drug use evolved over the years? And what factors do you think are like contributing to these changes?
So I think, over the years can mean a lot of things depending on how far back we go. But I think that if we just look at the recent past,
hmm
certainly like the past few years, with the COVID era, if you will, and even before that, there's been more and more and more pressures that's been piled on top of young people between like AP classes and college, almost seeming like mandatory in many cases within the last decade or two to have a more advanced career in many
hmm
ways, coupled with the rise of social media and cyberbullying and sexual predators online. I mean, there's so much that kids have to worry about right now,
hmm
right? That they didn't have to before. And then you even layer on top of that extra things in terms of the disruptions that happened during COVID, what we're dealing with right now with uh, polarization, like intense political polarization,
Yeah.
a lot of stress, just stress everywhere. I mean, we just had another school shooting 3 days ago, and which I'm gotta imagine is very concerning for teenagers right now. Much less the fact that we know for a fact that just going through active shooter drills is super stressful. So there's a lot more that's going on right now in terms of stress, and we have really solid peer-reviewed, evidence that's been published that shows that everyone right now is very stressed out, teenagers perhaps most of all, and drug use starts to get into this because it can seem at face value like a really easy way to deal with it. Because when you use a substance, at least in the moment, you can escape, right? If you're drunk, if you're high, people wouldn't use these substances if they didn't at least take you away for a little bit. The
Mhm.
problem is that it's not a sustainable way of dealing with your life. It's not a sustainable way of gaining social acceptance, which is another big reason why teens use if they're trying to be part of a social group, or maybe their friends have all started vaping or drinking or whatever it is, smoking, and they don't want to be left behind. There might be a lot of pressure, either explicit or implicit, for them to do it too. It gets to be really complicated. The problem is that it's not actually a healthy solution, and it can grow very easily into something that consumes you. But it doesn't happen immediately. It's more of like a lifestyle change that
Mhm.
slowly gets worse over time. And eventually, there are chemical hooks that set in. I mean, we could talk for quite a while about how addiction works, but it's kind of insidious that way. It might even feel like a good idea at the time, but ends up really biting you pretty hard in the long run.
Mhm. Yeah. So, um, from your perspective, like, what are the most like common misconceptions and misinformation surrounding like mental health and drug use, and how can like parents and like teenagers like effectively communicate about those things?
Mm. Well, again, there's so much we can talk about. I'll try to just keep it to some like of the most important points.
Mhm.
So on the mental health standpoint, I think the one of the biggest points of, we'll call it cultural misinformation, is that there's something wrong with you if you
Mhm.
have any struggles with mental health. There is not. The vast majority of people will have some mental health struggle throughout their life. Just like I don't know anyone who's never had any sort of medical problem that requires going to a doctor. We have this tremendous double standard between the body and the mind, which
Mhm.
is incredibly destructive. Honestly, even if you think about hygiene, right? We're taught from a very young age to brush our teeth every day and take showers and comb our hair so that we don't get knots. I mean, all of this standard upkeep we do on our bodies so that it stays healthy and works well, but
Mhm.
we don't do any of that for the mind. And so then when things start falling apart, because for many of us it will when we're put in these crucibles of stress and pressure that we're in all the time, then what do we do? People don't know what to do, so they start either internalizing it and getting depressed or anxious, or developing obsessions and compulsions, or they start externalizing it and start using drugs, or cutting themselves, or there's or getting into trouble at school. I mean, there's so many ways that it comes out. All of these are symptoms of unmet needs emotionally, where
Mhm.
people just don't know how to take care of their emotions in a healthy way. And so I think that if we stopped stigmatizing it, if we stopped being like, even parents sometimes don't want to take their kids to a therapist because they think it says they're bad parents, so they don't actually get, no one thinks that way about physicians. No one thinks that way about medical doctors. And we really need to understand that mental health works the same way. I mean, there are plenty of young people I've worked with who have great parents, not even ones who maybe are great parents, but made like that one error that means that their kid developed this, that, and the other thing. Stuff happens in life. You can't control everything. And, there's reasons why people develop anxiety disorders or get depressed, that actually make perfect sense when you understand how these things work.
Mhm.
It's not really a shame space. It doesn't have to go there. And so if we could be a bit more open about it, addiction as well, and talk to parents, talk to doctors, talk to therapists, talk to friends, and be more compassionate towards each other, I think we'd find that the outcomes would be far better than what we're seeing right now in our society. In terms of the substance side of things, if I had to pick the probably the most destructive pieces of misinformation, it would have to do with concepts around what we'll call it acceptability of certain types of substance use. Alcohol, for example, literally kills 100,000 people in the United States every year and has for quite some time. It kills more people every year than the overdose epidemic and has killed more people every year than opioids for a long time. Nobody talks about it. And there's a lot of reasons that are baked into money, that are baked into the place that alcohol has taken culturally in the world for a long time, where we just kind of view it as the cost of doing business. But that's not the case. Just to give you an example, there's a recommendation. It's not set in stone yet, but there's a recommendation coming down the pike that in 2026, all new vehicles are supposed to have what are called passive blood alcohol sensors in them. So this means you don't blow into anything. It either reads your blood alcohol through your fingertip when you're starting the car, or it can read it by your eye movements, like you have a camera facing your eyes, and there's certain ways your eyes move when you're drunk or impaired in some way. And then the car will just shut down, so you can't crash into anybody. Right now, and for years, we have about, I think it's 12,000 people who die in alcohol-related motor vehicle accidents every year. It
Mhm.
shouldn't take till 2026 to actually to fix this problem. But there's so much that we turn a blind eye to because we view it as just how society works. The same thing goes for with tremendous amounts of misinformation around vaping, nicotine vaping, and the chemicals that are in there and the toxins. And, we could talk about that for a very long time. It is toxic. It can cause cancer. It can cause, this vaping illness called EVALI based on basically fats entering the lungs because of some of what happens when you heat up certain chemicals. And then also with THC, or if you want to call it cannabis, marijuana, weed, whatever word is applies to what people are using, dabbing, if you're using the concentrates. It is physically addictive, particularly if you're a teenager. It actually affects the way your brain grows, like structurally, as well as how it works neurochemically in ways that sometimes you honestly can't reverse once you do that damage to yourself. And I think that right now there's a lot very pervasive myths about marijuana, about THC, that
Mhm.
make it seem a lot less destructive to the young mind in particular than it really is. So, I mean, we could talk about this for a very long time with all the misinformation that's going around right now about mental health and substance use, but those would be probably my most important categories.
Yeah, for sure. So, in terms of like education and like so that I know like parents and also schools play a huge role in that. And at my school like we have a health class for a semester during sophomore year, and we learn about like drugs in addition to like just yeah, just learning. We have like a lot of topics we cover, and drugs are and mental health are like included in that. But I know like a lot of schools like don't have that. So, how can schools and like communities like play a role in like promoting accurate information about these things and fostering like awareness, and also like how can parents like what can they do to like educate themselves and their children about these? Because yeah.
Yeah. So those are really good questions. So first of all, I think that schools, because all young people, unless you're being homeschooled, are required to go to school, I think schools should play a central role in teaching some of these skills and providing accurate information. Coupled with that, though, I really want to express that that means that we need to fund it because teachers are overworked and school counselors are unbelievably overworked. And so we are in the midst of a youth mental health crisis. The Surgeon General has declared it. It's widely recognized. Just to give you a quick uh, piece of information that was just published recently. So the Youth Risk Behavior Survey, a national survey, was put out by the CDC a couple months ago, and the most recent data we have is from 2021. And I am not making this up. I am not exaggerating. In 2021, 1 out of every 10 teenagers in the United States attempted suicide. 1 out of every 10. That is unacceptable. That is outrageous, and that is true. That is true data from the CDC. I'd recommend anybody look it up. When you're looking at data like that, I think it's completely unacceptable that we're not funding very wide scale distribution of better coping strategies, better screening, letting people, and then heading this off early, because something like a suicide attempt does not come out of nowhere. This is the buildup of a lot of stress or a lot of depression over generally a long period of time. And if we knew how to intervene, we could. So it's so important that we do it. How to do it is another question. There are a lot of ways that people can educate themselves. Uh, just off the top of my head, not to be self-promotional, but I have a YouTube channel where I put out informational snippets of like 3 to 5 minutes on a bunch of different topics. I'm just one guy, I'm just one psychologist. There's a lot of other people who do great work. There are books that have been put out. Um, I think the most important part, though, about consuming information is that you make sure it comes from a reliable source. We've unfortunately seen the rise of essentially TikTok therapists. Well, not even therapists, but like TikTok self-help, where there's people with no credentials out there trying to give information, some of which is inaccurate, some of which is harmful. So really making sure that we tap into reliable sources. But the whole reason why people are going to YouTube and not to put myself down then in the next in the next breath, but in TikTok is because they don't have any other way to get this information, and that's part of why I think that if we rolled it out through schools, why that would be so helpful and so important. And there are curricula that are around for that, and that definitely can help. Same thing from the parent standpoint. I think that there's some really basic training that we can do with parents in terms of teaching coping skills, but then also recognizing problems, because teachers have a limited view of their students. They don't see everything. Parents, hopefully, are more connected and more present and have a better idea if someone's mental health, one of their kids' health is shifting, their mental health is shifting. One program that does a very good job of this is called Mental Health First Aid. There's a certification course you can do. I'm fairly confident you can find a whole training course for this online. If not, there's a lot of people who train it in person, and just making sure that that is widely available. People can access it if they need it. But again, I just speaking for myself, I have 2 young kids. My life is absolute chaos. It's very difficult for me to have time to do something that's not required of me. And so I think that, just to be honest about it, it's so hard to be proactive. And so I think any amount that you can put these resources in front of parents, whether or not it's at school or other events they'd be going to anyway. I think
Mhm.
employers also, when it comes to parent training, could be really great allies in this, in terms of training employees on mental health first aid as part of the requirement for jobs, which could be
Mm.
helpful both in terms of their coworkers noticing if someone is having a problem, as well as their kids. How to do it is certainly half the battle. Funding it is a really, big question as well. But I think these days, if it's not structured into people's lives, it's very hard for people to proactively go out and find this. And by the time you get at it reactively, again, to get back to that dichotomy, sometimes it's already a little too late, or you've got a hole to dig yourself out of, or climb out of, rather.
Yeah. Um, yeah, I think those are really good like points. And what are some other resources, I guess, that people can that like individuals maybe can like educate themselves about these issues? Because like you talked about like what like schools can do and like what companies can do, and like the
Mhm.
mental health first aid thing is like a good resource I would
Mhm.
imagine. I haven't looked into it, but yeah, what are some other resources you would recommend, I guess?
Yeah. Well, so probably if people were looking to really say, like, how do I get started? How do I work with my kids on this? How do I work on it myself? I'm a huge fan of smartphone apps for this, particularly for basic training or low acuity problems like mild depression, mild anxiety. It can really help. So, two apps that do this in a really solid evidence-based way that anyone could download. And I should mention, I am not paid by these people, so I'm getting no kickback for this. Is Sanvelo. Sanvelo is one app that's on all mobile devices that does basic CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, and teaches you how to work with some of these problems and symptoms. Another one is Happify, that does a very good job of it's honestly like a gamification in many ways of the mental health improvement process, as well as teaching CBT skills. I'm also a huge proponent of mindfulness meditation, and then diaphragmatic or deep breathing. And two apps that I really like for that, again, that are not paying me, are Headspace is a really good all-purpose app for learning meditation that actually has meditations for teens and even younger kids as well. You know, goes all the way down to I think 5. There's some shorter, briefer ones, and that does a good job for people looking to dig a little bit deeper into mindfulness and meditation and how all that works. I really
Mhm.
love the app 10% Happier, so I'd fully endorse that one as well. But there are a lot of really good tools that you can use in the mental health space, and certainly I'm happy to your listeners to offer myself up as a resource as well. Again, you can check out my YouTube channel or my website at weinerphd.com. Just email me as well at aaron@weinerphd.com, and I'm happy to help you out and point you in the right direction if I can.
Mhm. Yeah, for sure. Um, so, uh, the last question I have, I guess, uh, it would be like, how can like society as a whole work to reduce the stigma around mental health and addiction, like on social media? I know there's a lot of things about that on social media, and then promote like open and honest conversations about these issues. Um, yeah.
So I think two ways come to mind. Um, One, and the most important one, is personal accountability, and that means being mindful about what you say and how you talk, taking feedback if you've been insensitive about something, taking that well, and just looking to learn and grow,
Hmm.
uh, as well as looking at when you don't speak. If you see something going on where someone is being shamed or stigmatized or put down in some way, making sure you speak up and you actually do your part in correcting the injustices that perpetuate the stigma and where people get othered and put down if they're struggling with something that's a very natural problem. I think the next level of that is we need role models for this in our society who are willing to step up and say, it's okay to get help. It's okay, these problems are natural human things, just like having strep throat or diabetes. Like these are things that happen to people, and that doesn't mean that you're weak or there's something wrong with you or that you belong in an insane asylum or any of these things, that are kind of like artifacts of the past where it was heavily stigmatized. And then we're definitely starting to see this more, right? There are some really high profile athletes who have been very forward about, I'm struggling like with something right now, I'm going to deal with it. And not only do you want to applaud, like I applaud them for doing that and uh, being a role model, essentially, is what I'm getting at. We need role models. But then also the people who say, good for you for saying that, right? And because right now we're not at a point yet where we can just take that for granted, where it's just assumed. Like it's still really important that people who self-disclose are celebrated honestly for it. Because, it's not like, yeah, you have a problem, problems are great, but it actually does take bravery to break through stigma and to be a role model for something that really needs to happen. And that can also sometimes embolden other people who really could use to be more forward and talk about their problems to get help, to
Hmm.
actually get that help that they need.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you for that. And is there anything else you would like to cover?
No, no, I just appreciate the chance to chat with you and to be on your program and to get the word out. I think we kind of stuck the landing there pretty well. We've all got a role that we can play. It takes all of us to make things better. And yeah, we just all got to get to work and keep keep the openness, keep the compassion front of mind, and we'll get there.
Hmm. Yeah, thank you for sharing your stories and insights. Um, I definitely learned a lot, and it was a really nice like perspective to hear from. And yeah, thank you.
My pleasure.